December 7th, 1941. The sun rises over the Pacific, casting a golden hue over the quiet waters of Pearl Harbor. Sailors on the USS Arizona are waking up, anticipating a lazy Sunday morning. The church bells in Honolulu are just beginning to ring. It is a paradise, and in exactly 5 minutes, it will become a slaughterhouse. We all know the story. We know about the Zeros screaming down from the clouds. We know about the torpedoes tearing through the steel of battleships. We know about the smoke that turned day into night. But what if the smoke didn't clear? What if the planes were just the beginning? History tells us that the Japanese Empire struck a blow to the American fleet and then turned back, satisfied with a raid. But history is written by the victors, and in this timeline, the victory was far from certain. In this timeline, the Japanese High Command made a different choice, a bolder choice, a choice that would plunge the United States into a nightmare of occupation and blood on its own soil. The pilots didn't just bomb the ships, they cleared the way, they strafed the beaches, they destroyed the coastal guns. And then, emerging from the mist on the horizon, came the silhouette that every American commander feared but never truly expected. Not just aircraft carriers, troop transports, hundreds of them. Before we go deeper, let me ask you something. If you're holding your phone right now or watching this on your screen, have you subscribed yet? If you haven't, do it now. Subscribe to World War II Stunned. The first sign that something was wrong, beyond the falling bombs, was the radio silence from the Kaneohe Naval Air Station. It wasn't just destroyed, it was taken. At 0900 hours, while the Arizona was still burning and the Oklahoma had capsized, lookouts at Diamond Head reported landing craft hitting the surf. This was not a raid, this was an invasion. The Empire of Japan had committed to the unthinkable, a full-scale amphibious assault on the territory of Hawaii. The logic was ruthless and, in hindsight, terrifyingly sound. Why merely wound the giant when you can strangle it in its crib? Admiral Yamamoto knew that a sleeping giant, once awakened, would destroy Japan. So he decided to cut the giant's throat. On the beaches of Oahu, the confusion of the air raid turned into the panic of ground combat. American soldiers, many still in their undress whites or half-uniformed, scrambled to find rifles and ammunition. There was no organized defensive line. The element of surprise was total. Japanese Imperial Marines, battle-hardened from years of war in China, stormed the sands of Waikiki. They moved with a terrifying speed and precision. They weren't just fighting soldiers, they were securing infrastructure, the power plant, the water supply, the communication hubs. By noon, the iconic Royal Hawaiian Hotel, the Pink Palace, had been seized and turned into a temporary command post for the Japanese Imperial Army. The American response was fragmented and desperate. General Walter Short, the commander of the Hawaiian Department, tried to rally a defense at Schofield Barracks, but the roads were clogged with fleeing civilians and burning vehicles. The skies belonged entirely to the enemy. Any American truck or tank that moved was instantly strafed by circling Zeros. It was a turkey shoot. The Japanese strategy relied on shock and speed, and they had both in abundance. They bypassed strong points, infiltrated American lines, and created pockets of chaos that paralyzed the chain of command. By sunset on December 7th, the American flag was not flying in Honolulu. The city was burning, occupied by foreign troops for the first time in its history. The surviving U.S. naval forces, battered and broken, were forced to scatter to the open sea or surrender. The shock was absolute. This wasn't just a military defeat, it was a psychological cataclysm. American soil, American citizens, and an American fleet were in enemy hands. The night of December 7th was a night of terror. In Washington, D.C., the mood shifted from confusion to a cold, paralyzing horror. President Roosevelt received the cables, his hands shaking not from his infirmity, but from the sheer magnitude of the disaster. The draft of his speech was changed. It would no longer be just a date which will live in infamy. It was the date the United States lost its gateway to the Pacific. The fear was palpable. If they could take Hawaii in a day, what was stopping them from taking California next week? The ocean, once a barrier, now felt like a highway for the invaders. As the sun rose on December 8th, the reality set in. The Japanese flag, the rising sun, draped over the balcony of the Iolani Palace. Thousands of American prisoners of war were marched through the streets of Honolulu, a humiliation designed to be photographed and broadcast to the world. The message from Tokyo was clear: the Pacific belongs to us. But in their victory, the Japanese made a fatal miscalculation. They assumed that the loss of Hawaii would force the United States to sue for peace, to accept a divided world. They did not understand the American psyche. They did not understand the nature of the rich warrior. They had taken the island, yes, but they had not taken the American soul. Instead, they had ignited a fury that was industrial, mechanical, and limitless. In the factories of Detroit, in the steel mills of Pittsburgh, and in the shipyards of Brooklyn, the shock turned into a grim resolve. The United States was not a warrior that fought for honor or territory alone. It was a warrior that fought with the weight of the world's largest economy. The Japanese had awakened the giant, and now that giant was going to reach for a sledgehammer. The invasion of Hawaii was the high watermark of the Japanese Empire. They had poked the bear. Now they would have to survive its claws. The occupation of Oahu was brutal. Martial law was immediately declared. The Kempeitai, the secret police, set up headquarters in downtown Honolulu. Curfews were strictly enforced. Food was rationed. The vibrant, multicultural population of Hawaii found themselves living under the boot of a totalitarian regime. But even as the Japanese celebrated their incredible tactical success, the strategic clock began to tick. Hawaii is an island. It relies on imports for almost everything, and while the Japanese Navy controlled the waters around the islands for the moment, they were thousands of miles from their home ports. They had extended their supply lines to the breaking point. Meanwhile, on the west coast of the United States, panic gave way to the greatest mobilization in human history. The loss of Hawaii stripped away the illusion of safety. Every man, woman, and child knew that the war was at their doorstep. There were no debates about isolationism anymore. The America First movement vanished overnight, replaced by a singular, unified roar for vengeance. The U.S. government didn't just ask for volunteers, it demanded total submission to the war effort. The economy was seized. Car manufacturers were told to stop making sedans and start making tanks. Refrigerator plants started making airplane parts. The U.S. was a rich warrior, and it was about to spend every cent it had on destruction. This sets the stage for a conflict unlike any other. A war not of island hopping in distant atolls, but a war of liberation, a crusade to retake American land. The Japanese thought they had won the war on the first day. They were about to learn that they had only started a war they could not possibly finish. The sleeping giant was awake, and now he was looking for a weapon.
The loss of Hawaii sent a tremor through the North American continent that registered on the psychological seismographs of every American citizen. The West Coast was no longer the edge of the world, it was the front line. San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Seattle went dark. Blackouts were not just drills, they were a way of life. Barbed wire was strung along the beaches of Santa Monica. Anti-aircraft guns were hoisted onto the roofs of Hollywood studios. The fear was real. If the Japanese Navy could project force to Oahu, the cities of California were within range of their carrier-based bombers. But fear in the United States has a unique way of transmuting into industry. The rich warrior does not cower, he builds. President Roosevelt, addressing a stunned Congress and a terrified nation, did not offer platitudes. He offered a promise of absolute, overwhelming force. He appointed Admiral Chester Nimitz to command the Pacific Fleet, or what was left of it. Nimitz's headquarters were not in Pearl Harbor, but in San Diego. His task was monumental: rebuild the fleet, protect the West Coast, and plan the greatest amphibious invasion the world had ever seen. and he had to do it while the enemy was sitting in his living room. The mobilization that followed was a testament to the terrifying power of American capitalism directed at a single purpose. The United States had money, it had resources, it had oil, steel, and coal in abundance, and now it had the will to use them all. The government issued unlimited contracts. Money was no object. The phrase cost plus became the mantra of the war effort. If a company could build a ship, the government would pay the cost plus a guaranteed profit. It was a fire hose of cash aimed at the industrial base. In months, the skyline of American port cities changed. Liberty ships were being built in days, not weeks. New classes of aircraft carriers, the Essex class, were laid down in shipyards from Newport News to Bremerton. These were not the converted cruisers of the past. These were floating cities designed to carry an air wing that could blot out the sun. The Japanese had sunk the battleships of the past, but they had merely cleared the dock space for the carriers of the future. The U.S. was building a navy that would not just rival Japan's, but dwarf it. While the factories churned, the strategic mind of the U.S. military began to work. Admiral Nimitz and General Marshall knew that a direct assault on Hawaii immediately would be suicide. The Japanese had had time to dig in. They had fortified the beaches of Oahu with the very guns they had captured from the Americans. They had turned the island into a fortress. So, the U.S. adopted a strategy of strangulation. The rich warrior uses his wealth to starve the enemy. The U.S. Navy's submarine force, the Silent Service, was unleashed with unrestricted orders. Their target was not the Japanese warships, but the merchant marine, the tankers and supply ships trying to bring food, fuel, and ammunition from Tokyo to Honolulu. It was a ruthless campaign. The waters between Japan and Hawaii became a graveyard. American submarines operating in wolf packs tore into the Japanese supply lines. The Japanese garrison on Hawaii, initially victorious and well-fed, began to feel the pinch. Rice rations were cut, then cut again. Fuel for their aircraft became scarce. The Japanese commanders in Honolulu, General Yamashita and Admiral Nagumo, realized too late the trap they had walked into. They had captured a prize they could not afford to keep. Hawaii had a population of civilians that needed to be fed and an occupation force that needed to be supplied. By the end of 1942, the paradise of the Pacific was becoming a prison of hunger. The U.S. wasn't attacking yet, it was letting the logistics do the killing. On the mainland, the training of the Liberation Force was underway. This was not just a draft, it was a mass induction of a generation. Young men from the cornfields of Iowa and the streets of the Bronx were sent to the deserts of California to train. They practiced amphibious landings until they could do them in their sleep. They learned to use flamethrowers, bazookas, and the new M1 Garand rifle. They were fed the best food, given the best boots, and equipped with the most reliable machinery on Earth. The American soldier was the most expensive soldier in history, and he was worth every penny. By mid-1943, the balance of power had shifted dramatically. The Japanese industry, strained to the breaking point by the war in China and the occupation of Hawaii, could not replace its losses. The American industry was just hitting its stride. For every ship the Japanese built, the Americans launched 10. For every pilot the Japanese trained, the Americans graduated 100. The rich warrior had purchased an army and a navy that was technologically superior and numerically infinite. The intelligence war was turning. American codebreakers, working feverishly in the basement of the Navy Department, had cracked the Japanese naval codes. They knew when the supply convoys were leaving. They knew the strength of the garrison on Hawaii. They knew that the Japanese morale was cracking under the strain of isolation and hunger. The time of waiting was over. The giant was ready to move. In the staging areas of San Diego and San Francisco, the Armada assembled. It was a sight that defied description. Miles of gray steel covering the ocean, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and at the center, the new fast carriers. Transports carrying hundreds of thousands of Marines and Army troops.
It was the Great White Fleet of Vengeance. The soldiers on board were not going to a foreign land. They were going home. They were going to retake American soil. The psychological weight of that mission cannot be overstated. They weren't fighting for a map coordinate. They were fighting for the 48 stars and the territory that belonged to them. As the fleet weighed anchor and turned its prow towards the setting sun, a message was broadcast to the ships from Admiral Nimitz. It was short and brutal. The road to Tokyo goes through Honolulu. We are going to take back what is ours. Give them hell. The Pacific Ocean, once a Japanese lake, was about to become an American highway. The invasion of the invaders was about to begin.
The approach to Hawaii in late 1943 was not a stealth mission. It was a thunderstorm rolling across the ocean. The U.S. Navy did not hide. It didn't need to. The armada was so vast that it stretched from horizon to horizon, a wall of steel advancing on the occupied islands. The Japanese radar on Oahu picked up the blips hours before visual contact, but there was nothing they could do. Their air force, starved of fuel and spare parts, was a shadow of the force that had attacked in 1941. The battle began not with boots on the ground, but with fire from the sky. The American carriers launched wave after wave of Hellcat and Corsair fighters. These were not the obsolete planes of 1941. These were machines built for dominance. They swept over Oahu, hunting down the few remaining Japanese Zeros. The dogfights were short and brutal. The American pilots, better trained and flying superior machines, swatted the enemy from the sky. Absolute air superiority was established within hours. Then came the thunder of the gods. The battleships, the new USS Iowa, the USS Missouri, and the resurrected ghosts of Pearl Harbor that had been raised and repaired, opened fire. The bombardment was earth-shattering. 16-inch shells, weighing as much as a Volkswagen, screamed through the air and slammed into the Japanese fortifications on Waikiki and Diamond Head. The ground shook. The pristine beaches were churned into a moonscape of craters and sand. The rich warrior was spending ammunition like it was water. Why send a man to die in a bunker when you can drop a mountain of explosives on it first? The landings began at dawn. It was D-Day, but in the Pacific, and years ahead of the timeline we know. The landing craft churned toward the shore, packed with U.S. Marines who looked at the burning coastline with a mix of rage and determination. They were landing on American beaches. They saw the shattered remnants of the Royal Hawaiian Hotel. They saw the Japanese flags fluttering over the bunkers. It made the blood boil in their veins. When the ramps dropped, the fighting was ferocious. The Japanese defenders, though starving and cut off, fought with the desperation of doomed men. They knew there was no retreat. They had dug tunnel networks into the volcanic rock, turning the island itself into a weapon. Machine gun fire raked the beaches, mortars fell like rain, but the American advance was relentless. Where the Japanese had spirit, the Americans had volume. If a machine gun nest held up a platoon, a tank was brought up to blast it at point-blank range. If a bunker was too tough, a flamethrower team burned it out. The battle for Honolulu was a house-to-house nightmare. American troops had to clear their own city, block by block. They moved past the familiar signs of American life, movie theaters, soda shops, post offices, now riddled with bullet holes and occupied by enemy snipers. The cognitive dissonance was jarring, fighting a war in a place that looked like home. But the overwhelming resources of the U.S. military began to tell. The Japanese ran out of ammo. The Americans had endless crates. The Japanese ran out of water. The Americans had desalination units. The Japanese ran out of men. The Americans had fresh reserves landing every hour. The turning point came at the Battle of the Pali Lookout. The Japanese forces had retreated into the jagged mountains, hoping to hold the high ground. The U.S. Army, utilizing their new superiority in artillery and air power, unleashed a barrage that literally reshaped the geography of the pass. Under the cover of this curtain of steel, American infantry charged up the steep slopes. It was brutal, hand-to-hand combat in the jungle, bayonets and knives, but the outcome was inevitable. The line broke.
By the third day, the U.S. flag was raised again over the Custom House in Honolulu. The image of a Marine climbing the pole, tearing down the rising sun and hoisting the stars and stripes became the iconic image of the war. It was a symbol that the invasion had failed. The thief had been caught in the house, and the homeowner had returned with a shotgun. But the cost was high. The streets of Honolulu were lined with the bodies of both invaders and liberators. The civilian population, emaciated and traumatized, emerged from their hiding places to greet the troops. They were walking skeletons, proof of the harshness of the occupation. The sight of American civilians starved on American soil hardened the hearts of the soldiers. There would be no mercy for the remaining Japanese holdouts. This wasn't just a military campaign anymore. It was a punishment. The U.S. Navy continued to encircle the other islands. Maui, Kauai, the Big Island, each was liberated in turn. The rich warrior method was applied systematically. Isolate, bombard, invade, overwhelm. The Japanese garrisons on these islands, cut off from command in Oahu, withered on the vine. Surrender was rare. Most chose suicide charges or ritual death. The Americans obliged them with walls of automatic fire. As the smoke cleared over Hawaii, the eyes of the U.S. military turned west. They had retaken their forward base. They had their unsinkable aircraft carrier back, and now they had an army that was bloodied, experienced, and fueled by a righteous anger. The road to Tokyo was open. The Japanese had started the war by taking Hawaii. The Americans were going to finish it by taking everything Japan had.
The liberation of Hawaii was not the end. It was the beginning of the end for the Empire of Japan. The psychological blow to the Japanese high command was catastrophic. They had played their ace card, the invasion of Hawaii, and it had been trumped by the sheer industrial might of the United States. They had lost their elite divisions, their best pilots, and a significant portion of their navy trying to hold an island they could never sustain. The gamble had failed. In the aftermath, Hawaii became the staging ground for the final annihilation of the Japanese Empire. The islands were transformed. Oahu didn't just go back to being a naval base, it became the most militarized zone on Earth. The rich warrior poured concrete, laid runways, and built stockpiles of weapons that were visible from space. The U.S. was not going to island hop slowly across the Pacific anymore. They had the momentum of a freight train. The war that followed was faster and more brutal than in our timeline. The U.S. Navy, fueled by the vengeance of the occupation, bypassed many of the outer defensive rings and struck straight for the Marianas and the Philippines. The Japanese Navy, desperate to stop the onslaught, threw everything they had into a final suicidal confrontation. But they were meeting a U.S. fleet that was 3 times the size of the one they faced in 1941. The result was not a battle. It was an execution. The American public, having seen the footage of occupied Honolulu and the condition of the liberated civilians, demanded unconditional surrender with a ferocity that terrified politicians. There was no talk of negotiation. The slogan, "Remember Pearl Harbor," had a new, darker meaning. It meant remember the invasion. It meant total war. This accelerated timeline had a terrifying conclusion. With the U.S. advancing so quickly, the Manhattan Project, the development of the atomic bomb, was racing to catch up with the front lines. In this timeline, the B-29s were flying from airfields in the Marianas by late 1944. The firebombing of Tokyo happened sooner. The destruction was more complete. The rich warrior had the resources to burn the enemy's wooden cities to the ground night after night. When the atomic bombs were finally ready, the debate on whether to use them was non-existent. The memory of the Japanese flag over Honolulu sealed the fate of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In fact, in this timeline, the U.S. might not have stopped at 2. The rage of the invaded nation demanded a display of power that would ensure no one would ever dare touch American soil again. The surrender of Japan was signed not on the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, but in the ruins of the Imperial Palace itself. The U.S. occupation of Japan was harsher, driven by the memory of their own occupation. The United States emerged from the war not just as a superpower, but as a hyperpower.
They had proven that even when stripped of their strategic advantages, even when invaded, their ability to generate violence through wealth and industry was unconquerable. The Japanese woke the dragon, and the dragon burned their world to ash. And that is the story history books almost had to write. The terrifying what-if that proves one undeniable fact. The only thing more dangerous than the U.S. military fighting abroad is the U.S. military fighting to take back its own home. This brings us to the end of this journey. If you enjoyed this dive into the alternate history of World War II, hit that like button. It helps the channel more than you know. And tell me in the comments, if Japan had invaded Hawaii, do you think the war would have ended sooner or later? I read every comment. Until next time, stay stunned.